What would you do if the woman you treated like wallpaper turned out to be the architect of your downfall? The fire began in silence, not with a shout or a slammed door, but with a faint smile from the woman no one ever saw coming. Eleanor Prescott had spent most of her life keeping everything polished, the silverware, the family name, and her silence. Her house was an echo of discipline and legacy, with mahogany floors that held generations of footsteps and a garden manicured so precisely it almost looked artificial. She'd buried her husband 5 years ago, along with her need for affection. All she had left was her son Daniel, a man she raised with all the devotion she'd withheld from herself. But sons forget, or maybe they never really look, especially when a woman like Celine walks into their life. Celine was the kind of beauty that made you question the lighting in your own house. She entered Daniel's world and quickly his mother's with the force of a summer storm, glamorous, disarming, and just enough sweetness to disguise the rot. She cooed Eleanor's name like it was some charming relic. She offered to cook, then giggled when she burned the roast. She complimented the furniture while mentally calculating its worth. You've met someone like her, haven't you? The type who smiles like a secret, who knows the rules of every room and how to quietly break them. Daniel was smitten. Of course he was. Men like him born into quiet power are always hungry for fire. And Celine knew just how to burn. The wedding came fast, too fast. Eleanor, always the poised matriarch, offered no objections, at least not aloud. But there was a tightening around her eyes during the ceremony, a flicker of something that only the maid Anna noticed. Anna had been with Eleanor for nearly a decade. A quiet woman from Sao Paulo, with hands that moved like prayers and eyes that missed nothing. Eleanor never called her the help. To Eleanor, Anna was a fixture like the antique clock that always chimed 5 minutes late and somehow made the silence less unbearable. After the honeymoon, things shifted. Celine moved into this Prescott estate like it was a stage she'd always belonged on. She rearranged the furniture not out of need, but dominance. She replaced the china Eleanor's mother had passed down with trendy ceramics from Italy. She called Anna by the wrong name and laughed when corrected. And Daniel, he saw none of it, or pretended not to. Isn't that how it goes? The ones you raise, the ones you shield, they're the first to hand you over when love clouds their judgment. Eleanor found herself sidelined in her own home, her advice dismissed, her presence treated like an afterthought. Once she walked into the living room and overheard Celine whisper to Daniel, "Your mother clings to this house like a ghost. Maybe it's time we gave her a smaller place somewhere quieter." Quieter. That word echoed in Eleanor's bones, but she didn't confront. She watched. She watched as Celine began wearing diamonds that hadn't been purchased, as bank statements arrived with unexplained withdrawals. As Daniel grew colder, his laughter replaced by sighs, his eyes emptying slowly like wine down a drain. She tried to talk to him once. He smiled, patted her hand, and said, "Mom, you don't understand how things work anymore. Let us take care of you now." Take care of her, like a porcelain doll or a dying dog. But Eleanor wasn't brittle. She was gathering. You see, some women don't scream when they're betrayed. Some women sip their tea, memorize your patterns, and plan their reckoning with the precision of a surgeon. So when the anniversary gala arrived, the one Eleanor hosted every year in honor of her late husband, she wore blue. Not just any blue, but the same shade she wore the day Daniel was born. A quiet symbol, a quiet declaration. The guests arrived, wine flowed, and Celine floated through the room like a peacock in pearls. She had no idea what was coming. Most don't. By the time Eleanor tapped her glass for silence, Anna was already waiting by the study, a manila folder tucked discreetly under one arm. "Thank you all for coming." Eleanor began, her voice smooth as silk, soaked in ice. "Tonight I want to make a special announcement about legacy, about loyalty, and about knowing who your true family is." Every gaze turned toward her, including Celine's, who tilted her head just slightly, unsure whether to smile or brace. "You should never underestimate the woman you ignore." Eleanor gestured toward Anna, who stepped forward without hesitation. The room fell into a breathless hush, not because Anna was known, but precisely because she wasn't. People like her were trained to disappear behind polished glassware and catered hors d'oeuvres. But tonight, she walked through the center of the Prescott ballroom like she owned the damn floor. "This," Eleanor said, placing a gentle hand on Anna's shoulder, "is the woman who has stood beside me for 10 years, through grief, through transition, through betrayal." Celine's eyebrows arched, amusement flickering behind her eyes like static. The same kind of smirk you've seen on someone who's about to dismiss you with a sentence and a toss of perfect hair. Eleanor ignored her. I was recently reviewing the terms of my estate. She continued, her voice rising only slightly, just enough to slice the silence. And I've decided it's time for a change. I'm not interested in preserving a family name if the family no longer remembers its own soul. There it was. A hush deeper than before. A room strung up by invisible thread held between breath and collapse. Celine's voice was the first to break through. Sweet, poisoned honey. "Darling, what's going on?" she asked, turning toward Daniel with practiced confusion. "Is this one of those dramatic surprises your mother loves?" But Daniel wasn't smiling, because Anna had opened the folder, and inside it were copies of account statements, wire transfers, forged signatures, and a contract Celine had hidden in a locked drawer, the one Eleanor had a duplicate key for. "You felt that, didn't you? That drop in the gut." Celine did too. The blood drained from her face in slow-motion humiliation as Anna handed Eleanor a notarized document. "This," Eleanor said, "is the updated will and trust. I no longer require the Prescott Foundation to remain under the family's bloodline. From this moment on, the estate, the liquid assets, the charitable holdings, everything will be transferred into a trust, managed jointly by myself and Anna." Celine opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her voice, her sharpest weapon, had abandoned her. Daniel took a step forward. "Mother, this is ridiculous. She's the maid." Eleanor turned to him with something colder than anger. Pity. "No, Daniel. She's the woman who treated this home with respect. She's the woman who stayed when you pulled away when your wife tried to erase my name from the walls your father built with his bare hands. She is loyal, and I am not blind." "It's always the silence before the scream, isn't it?" Celine broke it not with a shout, but a laugh, high-pitched, frantic. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice cracking. "You're giving your fortune to a maid." "What, to teach me a lesson?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "No, dear. I don't teach lessons. I execute them." The gasp rippled through the room like thunder under fine crystal. And then the twist of the knife, elegant, slow, deliberate. "I've also filed for a forensic audit of the joint account you share with Daniel," she added. "If your intentions were pure, you have nothing to worry about. You see, that's the thing about power. When you hold it too tightly, you mistake silence for submission. But real strength, it's patient, it's calculating. And when it moves, it's already too late to run." Daniel stood frozen, his world shifting beneath him like wet sand. Eleanor glanced around the room, her eyes sweeping across the stunned crowd. "Tonight was meant to honor the past. But I've realized the past is only worth something if it guides you toward truth." And with that, she lifted her glass. "To those who remain true in the shadows, to those who don't need diamonds to reflect light, and to those who know that blood may bind but it's loyalty that crowns." She didn't look at Celine again. She didn't have to. Because women like Eleanor don't chase validation, they summon consequences. The aftermath arrived not in explosions but in eerie stillness. Guests trickled out in silence that night, offering thin smiles and whispered condolences that weren't really for Eleanor but for themselves. Because watching a dynasty woman shatter her own bloodline publicly forces people to confront the quiet lies they've made peace with in their own lives. Celine, dazed and brittle, disappeared before midnight. She didn't scream, she didn't throw things. She just stood there, makeup immaculate and soul unraveling, while the foundations of her fantasy life crumbled at her designer heels. Daniel called after her once, twice, but the echo swallowed his voice whole. He was left in the ballroom, eyes glazed, the air around him hollow. Eleanor didn't speak to him that night. She didn't need to. When a son chooses to marry a mirror instead of a woman, one that reflects only what he wants to see, there's very little a mother can say to bring him back. He has to meet his own shadow first, alone. The next morning, Anna found Eleanor in the garden trimming roses like it was any other day. Sunlight filtered through the trees, warming the edges of her silver-streaked hair. There was peace in her movement, the kind that only arrives after choosing pain with purpose. "You didn't have to give me all that," Anna said, gently, voice trembling. Eleanor paused, the shears resting in her hand like a crown in waiting. "I didn't give it to you," she replied. "I entrusted it to you. And there's a difference, isn't there? People give things to be seen as generous. But to entrust, that requires belief. It means you see a person's soul, not just their circumstance." Anna wiped her hands on her apron. "They'll talk. They'll say you lost your mind." Eleanor smiled. "They already did, when I stayed quiet for too long. Now they'll just have something new to fear a woman who doesn't need their approval." The papers came out within the week. Society blogs clawed for details. Heiress disinherits son, leaves fortune to housekeeper. The headlines wrote themselves, but none of them captured the truth. Because no one ever really writes about the emotional tax of being dismissed, the slow decay of watching your value measured only in silence and convenience. Celine, as expected, tried to play victim. She claimed manipulation, coercion, betrayal. But Daniel knew. Somewhere deep beneath the denial and entitlement, he knew. Because when he finally tried to access their joint account and found it emptied under legally documented transactions, the truth hit with the cruelty of hindsight. Eleanor had predicted every move. She hadn't just taken away the fortune. She'd set up protections, a fortress of legal glass that even love couldn't smash through. Daniel came back 2 weeks later, alone. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't bring apologies. Just stood at the doorway of his childhood home, looking smaller than she remembered. "I didn't know," he murmured. "No," Eleanor said calmly. "You chose not to." That stung, the kind of sting that breaks through generational blindness. He nodded, lips tightening, and asked, "Is there anything left for me?" Eleanor considered this. She wasn't a cruel woman, but cruelty and consequence often wear similar masks. What you had was never about money, Daniel. It was about access, and you gave that away freely. He lowered his eyes. The man who once told her she didn't understand how things worked now stood before her, stripped of illusions, stripped of the woman who used him, and finally, stripped of his superiority. "I don't hate you," she said more softly than he deserved, "but I don't owe you either." The words didn't come from bitterness, they came from healing. Because this is what happens when a quiet woman reclaims her voice. She doesn't shout, she doesn't destroy. She simply stops allowing herself to be erased. And that's the real revenge, isn't it? Not fury, freedom. The days moved on slow and golden. Eleanor spent them walking the halls she no longer had to defend. The house felt lighter. Not emptier, just finally rid of the invisible hands trying to rewire its heart. Anna was no longer just a helper. She managed accounts, oversaw the charities, handled correspondence. They ate together now, not as employer and employee, but as women who had survived the same storm from opposite ends of the ship. And on some evenings, they would sit by the fire sipping wine, not talking much, because some victories don't need retelling. They simply need to be felt. Weeks melted into months, and with them went the last traces of who Eleanor had once been, the ornamental widow, the invisible matriarch, the silent enabler. That woman no longer existed. What remained was a figure composed of steel and warmth, velvet and stone, a contradiction the world struggled to categorize. She didn't care. Eleanor had stopped living for categories. The whispers faded, replaced by nods of respect, often laced with fear. Society wasn't kind to women who rewrote their narratives, especially those who did so without flinching. But there was something undeniable about her now. Something regal, not because of her wealth, but because she'd proven what true power looked like: restraint, wielded with surgical precision. Celine, meanwhile, attempted reinvention. She posed as a victim in podcasts and interviews, playing the misunderstood wife caught in a storm of wealth and betrayal. But her charm wilted outside the Prescott estate. Without Daniel's name, her sparkle dulled. And when the court letters came, not threats but firm demands for restitution over fraudulent withdrawals, she disappeared from the public eye like a flame sucked into vacuum. Daniel tried to rebuild. He moved into a small apartment in the city, took up a consulting job arranged by one of his old college friends, one of the few who hadn't cut ties. But you could see it in his eyes now. The weight of consequence had aged him. He stopped showing up to social events, stopped posting curated smiles with curated people. He had finally learned the lesson Eleanor never wanted to teach him, that love doesn't equal leniency, that being a son doesn't mean immunity, and perhaps most important, that apologies only matter when they're lived. Once Eleanor received a letter from him. No return address, no date, just words scratched onto fine parchment. "I didn't understand what loyalty looked like until I saw it in someone I never bothered to look at." She folded the letter without tears. Forgiveness didn't require access. She could forgive him and still never let him back in. Anna flourished. There was something quietly luminous about her now, as though she had stepped into skin that was always hers, but had never been safe to wear. She carried herself not with pride, but certainty. And Eleanor truly saw her for the first time as an equal, not an extension. People talked, of course they did. Some whispered that Eleanor had lost her grip. Others speculated that Anna had manipulated her way into fortune. But those were the same voices who never once noticed the way Anna soothed Eleanor's grief after her husband died. The ones who never saw how she tucked blankets around her knees during the worst winters. the ones who missed that Anna was the only person who asked after Daniel's wedding if Eleanor was okay. And that's the thing, isn't it? We notice the people who take from us, but we forget to cherish the ones who stay. In time, Eleanor converted part of the estate into a foundation, one focused on supporting domestic workers, caretakers, and women over 50 navigating sudden life changes. She called it the Quiet Bloom. When asked about the name, she simply said, "Some of us were never planted in the light, but we still find ways to bloom." By the year's end, the Prescott name was no longer associated with old wealth or outdated legacy. It had become something else, a symbol of reckoning, of reclamation, of what it looks like when a woman stops asking for permission to exist. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor stood on the front steps of her estate with Anna beside her. They watched as a group of women from the foundation walked the garden paths, their laughter floating like petals on wind. Anna turned to her. "You really did it." Eleanor's eyes were on the trees, their leaves shedding without apology. "No," she said softly, "we did." And that was the final truth. Because revolution doesn't always come from raised fists. Sometimes it comes from setting a dinner table with one extra seat, from turning your silence into strategy, from realizing that the woman you dismissed was never small, just patient. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.